A drunk midwife from Paris is the last person the historical record puts in the room with her. That's how it ends. Not a war, not poison, not some great political reckoning that the chroniclers could chew over for a century. A trusted old woman who liked her wine more than she should have, standing over a 27-year-old duchess in the middle of her 9th childbirth in a dozen years, in a cold ducal palace in Nancy, in the dead middle of February. The man who wrote that detail down, Brantôme, who actually visited her court and met her in person, didn't dress it up or soften it. He just said, more or less flatly, that she died in childbed through the appetite of an old midwife of Paris, a drunkard, in whom she had more faith than in any other. And then he moved on, the way people in that century moved on from things like this, because there was always another death waiting patiently behind the last one. That's Claude of Valois, the second daughter of a king. The favorite child, by most accounts, of one of the most feared women in all of Europe. A girl who was married off at 11, who spent essentially her entire adult life either pregnant or recovering from being pregnant or bracing herself to be pregnant again, and who never once got the chance to find out what it was like to be old or even properly middle-aged. She isn't famous. Her sisters and brothers are. Her mother is on every list anyone has ever made of history's most ruthless or most dangerous women. Claude just kept her head down and did the one thing royal women were built to do, over and over and over again, until it finally killed her in a sealed room in winter. Before we go any deeper into it, welcome in. If you're new here, this channel is the place where we sit down with the lives of people history mostly walked past, the ones who lived in the shadow of louder, brighter, bloodier relatives, and we try to do it honestly, without flattening them into a puppet for some tidy little moral at the end. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back, especially the regulars, and especially the supporters who make these longer, slower ones actually possible to make. And do me one small favor while you get settled in. Let me know down in the comments where you're listening from. I mean it. I love seeing how far these stories travel, what corner of the world somebody's in while a 400-year-old French duchess plays in their ears. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing while this runs in the background, glad you're here with me. Now, back to a girl who was born under a faintly awkward little cloud before she'd done a single thing to deserve it. She was born on the 12th of November, 1547, at Fontainebleau, and almost immediately there was a small problem with where she came from, or rather, where the court decided she came from. The whole court got it into its collective head that she'd been conceived at the Château d'Annay. Annette was the home of Diane de Poitiers, her father's mistress, the older woman who had a grip on King Henry II that lasted essentially his entire adult life and never really loosened. So the baby picked up a nickname before she could even hold her own head up, Mademoiselle d'Annay, a little joke passed hand to hand around the court the way courts always pass these things, half affection and half something sharper underneath. Her mother hated it. And you can understand exactly why she hated it. Catherine de' Medici was the queen. She was the one who had actually done the work, carried the child, borne the child, risked her life in the doing of it the way every woman of that age risked her life. and the court had cheerfully decided to attach the infant's name to the place associated with the rival who was humiliating the queen on a daily basis, in her own home, at her own table. It's a small thing, it's almost too small to mention, but it's the very first fact of Claude's life, and it tells you with surprising precision exactly what kind of household this child had been dropped into. A house where even a baby's pet name was a tiny, simmering battlefield, where nothing was neutral, where every word carried a little freight of who was up and who was down that week. She was named, properly and officially, after her grandmother, Claude of France, the first wife of King Francis I, who had died long, long before this second Claude ever drew breath. I want you to hold on to that name, the grandmother. Tuck it somewhere in the back of your mind, because she is going to cause us a genuine problem a little later, and it'll help if you remember she existed, and that the two of them shared everything but a lifetime. The nickname, the Annette thing, is the sort of small detail that's easy to wave away. And I don't want to make too much of it, but stay with it one more beat, because it set the angle of her whole childhood. To be the daughter the court half-jokingly associated with the mistress's house is to start life already slightly out of place in your own family. Her older sister Elizabeth was the glittering one, destined for the greatest match in Europe. Her brothers were the future of the dynasty, watched and fussed over as the carriers of the crown. And Claude was the second daughter, frequently ill, saddled with a teasing little name that needled her mother every time someone used it. None of this was her fault, and none of it was anything she chose. But the pecking order of a royal nursery is a real thing, and Claude seems to have landed somewhere in the quiet middle of it. Not neglected exactly. Her mother clearly loved her, but never the one the whole court was looking at. She grew up learning to be the gentle, agreeable, overlookable one, and in a strange way, that early training, the habit of being the one who smooths things over rather than the one who shines, is exactly the person we find later, weeping at her mother's side, trying to save her sister, helping her husband govern, defending Marguerite against the gossip. The second daughter learned her role young, and she played it her whole short life. Now, the family she landed in, because the family is the whole frame around her. Her father was Henry II, King of France, a serious man, athletic, somewhat melancholy by temperament, a man who loved hunting and jousting, and his mistress, in more or less that order, and who tolerated his wife with a kind of distant courtesy for most of their marriage. Her mother was Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine banker's daughter, the foreign bride, the woman who had spent the first 10 years of her marriage unable to conceive a single child, watched for it, pitied for it, whispered about, very nearly set aside and sent home for it, because a barren queen is a political failure and everyone treated her as one. And then, when the dam finally broke, she produced child after child in a kind of helpless flood, as if her body were trying to make up for a decade of failure all at once. By the time Claude arrived, Catherine had become, in the most literal and most physically punishing sense, a machine for making royal heirs. And she would keep going for years yet. Claude was the third of the 10 children Catherine eventually bore, and the second of the ones who lived long enough to matter. The siblings are the reason almost nobody talks about Claude, so let me line them up for you, because the contrast is the point. Her older sister was Elizabeth, who would grow up to become Queen of Spain, married to the most powerful monarch in Europe. Her younger brothers were practically a parade of kings, one after another. Francis II, sickly and short-lived, married to Mary, Queen of Scots. Charles IX, who would have a massacre chained to his name for the rest of recorded time. Henry III, the last of the Valois kings, clever and strange and theatrical and doomed. And the youngest brother, Francis, Duke of Alençon, and then of Anjou, the restless, scheming one who spent his whole short life lunging at one throne or another and never quite closing his hand around any of them. And then, of course, the famous little sister, Margaret, Marguerite, Reine Margot, the queen of legend, the beautiful, scandalous one who became the subject of novels and films and operas 4 full centuries after she died. So set the family portrait in your head. A queen of Spain, 3 separate kings of France, and the single most romanticized princess in the whole of French history. And then, tucked quietly in among them, frequently unwell, easy to overlook, a girl your eye slides right past in a crowded painting. There's Claude. If you'd been a betting person standing in that nursery in 1550, you would not have put a single coin on Claude, being the one whose life turned out, in some ways, to be the saddest of the entire litter. The flashy ones usually get to keep the tragedy. The tragedy goes where the spotlight already is. But Claude got hers anyway, in a slower, quieter, more relentless form than any of them, and almost nobody noticed, then or since. The royal children were raised together in the nursery, the way royal children always were, set somewhat apart from their parents, shuffled from palace to palace depending on the season and the plague and the latest twitch of court politics. Fontainebleau, Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The day-to-day work of raising them fell to the governor and governess of the royal children, Jean Dumière and his wife Françoise, capable people who took their actual orders up the chain from Diane de Poitiers. Yes, the mistress. Diane was, for a long and humiliating stretch, effectively in charge of the upbringing and education of the Queen's own children. And I want you to really sit in that for a second, because it's the sort of thing we read past too quickly. The other woman didn't only have the king's affection and the king's attention and the king's knights. She also had a controlling say in how the Queen's babies were fed, dressed, taught, and raised. That is a level of domestic humiliation that's genuinely hard to hold in your head. Catherine had to hand her children, in some real sense, into the supervision of the woman the whole court knew was sleeping with her husband. And she had to smile about it, because she had no other choice that wouldn't end with her on a boat back to Italy. Into that crowded, watched, carefully micromanaged nursery came another little girl who'd matter enormously to history, Mary, Queen of Scots, shipped off to France as a small child to be raised alongside the Dauphin she was destined to marry. So Claude grew up in a packed little world of miniature royals, every single one of them being prepared like a chess piece, polished and positioned for marriages that had, in most cases, already been decided by treaty before the children could walk. Not one of these children was being raised toward anything you or I would recognize as happiness. They were being grown for export, cultivated like a crop, each one a future signature on some agreement between great powers, each one a way of binding one crown to another with a body and a wedding ring. The actual physical conditions of that upbringing are worth dwelling on a moment, because we tend to imagine royal childhood as soft and cushioned, and it really wasn't. The children moved constantly, dragged from chateau to chateau ahead of outbreaks of plague and sweating sickness, because a stationary court was a court that could be wiped out by a single bad summer. The nurseries were enormous, well-staffed, expensive operations, but they were also frequently grieving operations because the children kept dying. Claude had a little brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, born in 1549, who lived barely a year. The household would have absorbed that loss the way it absorbed all the others, with ceremony and then with a kind of brisk practicality, because there were always more children and always more to manage. A girl like Claude grew up watching siblings appear and disappear, learning early and without anyone needing to explain it, that small bodies were fragile and that mourning was a recurring chore rather than a singular event. She herself was, remember, the delicate one, the one who caught things. So she would have spent a fair amount of her early childhood being the patient rather than the visitor, tucked into a sickbed in one of those enormous cold rooms, while physicians who understood almost nothing about what they were treating debated her humours over the top of her. And presiding over all of it, at a careful distance, was her mother. Catherine de' Medici was not a cold or absent parent in the way the legend sometimes paints her. By the standards of royal motherhood in that century, she was, if anything, unusually attentive and unusually anxious about her children's health. Perhaps precisely because she'd waited 10 agonizing years to have any at all, and knew exactly how easily they could be taken away again. She fussed. She wrote letters about their illnesses. She wanted them near her. That instinct, to keep her children gathered close and watched over, is going to turn out to be one of the few real advantages Claude had in life. Because of all the daughters, Claude was the one who ended up close enough to stay in her mother's orbit. Here's the place where I have to be careful with you and slow right down, because this is the part of Claude's story that gets repeated absolutely everywhere, and most of the places repeating it are getting it flatly wrong, or at the very least, repeating something they cannot actually back up when you press them on it. The popular version of Claude, the one you'll find with about 30 seconds of searching, says she was sickly and deformed, that she had a hunched back, a curvature of the spine, that she had a club foot, that she limped through the corridors of Nancy, the frail, twisted little princess, pitied at court, lucky to have been married off at all. It's everywhere. And when you actually go looking for where that claim originally comes from, where the source under it is, the whole thing more or less dissolves in your hands like wet paper. The honest situation is this, and I want to lay it out plainly so you can judge it for yourself. The specific, vivid descriptions of a hunchback and a lame foot and a small, sickly, twisted frame, those descriptions are real. They genuinely exist. They were written down by contemporaries, by ambassadors who saw the woman in person and recorded what they saw. But they are describing the grandmother, the first Claude, Queen Claude, the wife of Francis I. There's a chaplain, an Italian named Antonio de Beatis, travelling through France with a cardinal in 1517, who wrote that Claude was young and very small in stature, plain and badly lame in both hips. There's an Austrian ambassador who described her as thin, pale, sickly, slightly hunchbacked, and somewhat lame. Those are real, first-hand eyewitness accounts of a genuinely disabled queen who lived and suffered and died a generation before our Claude was born. And over the centuries, because the two women share a name and a country and a rough corner of the same family tree, the grandmother's body got quietly, carelessly transferred onto the granddaughter. The deformity attached itself to the wrong Claude, like a label that fell off one jar and got stuck on the one beside it, and nobody bothered to check. I'm not standing here telling you that our Claude was a portrait of glowing health. I'm telling you that the dramatic, deformed princess image you'll find absolutely everywhere does not have a solid source sitting underneath it, and that the one single person who actually met her and bothered to write down what she looked like said something completely different. Brantôme, who went to Lorraine, who saw her with his own eyes, said she resembled her mother in beauty, not a hunchback, not a clubfoot, beauty. He said the people of Lorraine found her kind for as long as she lived, and that he had seen that kindness himself, in person, when he travelled to that country. So the only first-hand portrait we possess of this woman is a flattering one, written by someone who was actually there, and the cruel and famous one belongs, on the evidence, to somebody else entirely. What can we actually say about her health then, fairly, without borrowing her grandmother's pain? A couple of things, and they're real, and they're sad enough on their own. Catherine de' Medici's children, taken as a group, were not robust people. With the loud and shining exception of Marguerite, who was the healthy, vivid, durable one, the Valois children were a frail brood, sick often, several of them dead young, of illnesses that look to modern eyes a great deal like inherited disease running quietly through the bloodline. Tuberculosis gets named again and again by people trying to explain the pattern, and Claude, specifically, was described as a child who was frequently vulnerable to one illness or another, the sort of child who caught whatever was going around and took longer than the others to shake it off. And as a grown woman, she fell seriously ill at least once that we can actually date, on the road to her sister's wedding, sick enough that her own mother had to stop everything and nurse her back up. So the word sickly is not invented out of nothing. It has a real foundation. It's just that the truthful version of it is gentler and quieter and in a strange way sadder than the cartoon. A girl from a delicate family, prone to illness, whose body was then asked, as we'll see, to do something genuinely brutal over and over again until it simply couldn't anymore. I wanted to clear that up early, right at the front, before we go any further. Because if I let the hunchback and the club foot just sit there unchallenged, as established fact, the whole shape of her story tilts in the wrong direction. It turns her into an object of pity from birth, and Claude deserves a great deal better than to spend eternity wearing her grandmother's deformities stacked on top of her own very real suffering. She had plenty of her own. She didn't need to borrow, and the grandmother, the first Claude, deserves a word here too, because she's not just a footnote in this confusion. She's a real person whose real life got flattened into a single detail. Queen Claude, Louis XII's daughter, the first wife of Francis I, was a small, frail, devout woman who was, by the accounts of people who actually saw her, genuinely disabled, lame in the hips, slight and pale, and she spent her brief life doing exactly what her granddaughter would later do. She bore child after child, 7 of them in 9 years of marriage, while her husband openly kept mistresses and treated her, at best, as a useful instrument of state. And she died at 24, worn out, almost certainly by the relentless childbearing, possibly with another pregnancy underway. So when later writers lazily smeared the grandmother's deformity onto the granddaughter, they were, without meaning to, telling a deeper truth they didn't notice. The two women weren't alike in their bodies, as far as we can tell. They were alike in their fates. 2 Claudes, married into the machinery of the French and adjacent royal houses, bred until they broke, dead in their 20s, separated by half a century and joined by a name and a destiny. Let's talk for a moment about how the medicine of the 16th century would actually have handled a curved spine or a twisted foot, even supposing she'd had one, because it tells you something true about the world she lived in, regardless of what her own body was like. The great surgeon of the French court in exactly this period was a man named Ambroise Paré, and I want you to remember that name, because he is going to walk into this story again at a far grimmer moment, and very soon. Paré was genuinely, remarkably ahead of his time. He's the man credited with the first organized attempts at orthopedic bracing in the Western world. He designed an iron corset, perforated all over with little holes so that it wouldn't be completely unbearable in its weight, meant to try and correct a curvature of the spine, and his version of that device stayed in use for something like 100 years after his death. He wrote, in his own words, that children with these conditions ought to wear fine iron corsets pierced with holes so they weren't too heavy, and that for a growing girl the whole thing would have to be remade fresh every 3 months as her body changed underneath it. Read that back to yourself slowly. A growing child, locked in iron, the iron refitted 4 times a year because she keeps growing inside it. That was the cutting edge. That was the very best help the most advanced medical mind in France could offer. And for a clubfoot, what you got was manipulation, splints, corrective boots, hands physically forcing bone and tendon and ligament into a shape they didn't want to hold, the work usually done by a barber surgeon or some village bone setter with strong hands and a rough idea. The point of all this being, even the finest the age had to offer was crude and painful, and mostly didn't work. So whatever Claude's body was truly like, sound or not, she lived in a century that had next to nothing to offer anybody that refused to cooperate, and it offered what little it had with iron and force. Now to the thing her body was actually for, as far as the people arranging her entire life were concerned, the marriage, because that's what she was raised to be. That was the export she'd been cultivated for. Claude was married off as one piece of a peace deal, and to understand the deal you have to understand the chessboard she'd been set down on. Lorraine, The Duchy of Lorraine was a semi-independent territory wedged right in between the Kingdom of France on one side and the sprawling Holy Roman Empire on the other, one of those eternally unlucky in-between lands that spends its whole existence being squeezed by larger neighbors, each of whom wants, above all, to make absolutely certain it doesn't drift toward the other one. France wanted Lorraine friendly, or, better still, France wanted Lorraine controlled. In 1552, Henry II simply marched in and took the three bishoprics, Metz, Toul and Verdun, ended the regency that had been quietly running the duchy, and took the young duke, a boy named Charles, away with him to be raised at the French court. Let's be honest and plain about what that actually was, underneath the diplomatic language. Charles was a boy. Born in Nancy in 1543, he'd lost his father young, and France solved its Lorraine problem by essentially taking the child hostage and then calling it an education to make everyone feel better about it. He was raised in France, polished up and trained by some of the finest minds the kingdom could put in a room with him. The logician Ramus, the scholar Amiot, who'd translated Plutarch into the French everyone read, the statesman Michel de l'Hôpital. He was given everything a young prince ought to have, and held there, the whole time, as a living, breathing guarantee that Lorraine would behave itself. And the betrothal to Claude was the elegant bow tied around the entire grubby arrangement. Marry the captured duke to one of the king's daughters, and suddenly you can call the hostage-taking a family alliance. A union of two great houses. Everybody gets to save face, and the truth of it gets folded up small and put away in a drawer. The good news, if there's any good news to be found in here, is that the arrangement meant Claude and Charles grew up in the very same place. They knew each other as children. He wasn't some stranger she'd be packed onto a cart and shipped off to meet for the first time at the altar. They'd shared a court, shared tutors and rooms and years. And that, it turns out, is not nothing. It's going to matter quite a lot later on, because by virtually every account that survives, their marriage turned out to be one of the genuinely affectionate ones. Rare enough, in this whole cold business of dynastic matchmaking, to be remarked upon by people who saw it. And the squeezed position of Lorraine, that in-between land caught between France and the Empire, wasn't just background scenery for Claude. It shaped what her life in Nancy actually demanded of her. As the Duchess, and as a daughter of France married into a duchy France wanted to keep close, she was herself a piece of the balancing act. Her very presence in Nancy was France's reassurance that Lorraine remained inside the family, tied by blood to the crown next door. Every christening she hosted, every French royal who passed through her court, every letter that went back and forth between Nancy and her mother in Paris was part of keeping that delicate connection warm, without letting it tip into outright domination. She was, in a sense, France's gentlest instrument in Lorraine, and Lorraine's softest link to France, all at once. Charles played the hard diplomatic game of staying neutral between two giants. Claude played the quieter version of the same game inside her own household, being the living thread that kept the powerful neighbor friendly. It's a role that asks for tact, patience, and self-effacement, and everything we know about her suggests she had all three in abundance. The squeeze that defined her husband's whole reign ran straight through her marriage and her body, because her marriage and her children were, at bottom, the mortar holding the alliance together. They were married on the 19th of January, 1559, at Notre Dame in Paris. Claude was 11 years old. 11. Charles was around 15 or 16. Her dowry was 300,000 écus, plus a piece of territory called Stenay. So set the scene as it really was. An 11-year-old girl, in a wedding gown, in the great cathedral of Paris, marrying the boy France had been quietly holding on to for the better part of 7 years, and the entire event functioning, at bottom, as a diplomatic signature on a piece of parchment. Because of her age, the marriage was not consummated, and there was no expectation that it would be. Nobody in that cathedral imagined otherwise. She would go to Lorraine later, when she was older, when her body was judged by the relevant adults to be ready for what would be asked of it. For now, it was paperwork in the shape of a child in a beautiful dress. The age is the thing modern listeners snag on, and rightly, so let me be clear about how it actually worked, because it's both worse and slightly less straightforwardly monstrous than it first sounds. This type of marriage among royalty was completely normal, expected, unremarkable. Girls were betrothed and married in childhood all the time because the marriage was a treaty first and a relationship a distant second. The understanding, generally observed, was that the girl would not be expected to actually live with her husband as a wife or to bear children until she was older, usually mid-teens. So the 11-year-old at Notre Dame was being legally bound, not handed over. The horror isn't a single dramatic violation on the wedding night. It's slower and more bureaucratic than that. It's a child whose entire future, whose body's entire purpose, has been decided and signed and sealed before she's old enough to have any say in any of it, and who then has a few short years of grace before that future arrives and starts using her up. Claude got those few years. And then, right on schedule, the using up began. The wedding was just one part of a much larger burst of celebration, because France had at long last made peace. The big treaty, the Peace of Cateau Cambrésis, was signed a couple of months later, and it brought an end to the long, grinding, ruinous Italian wars that had bled France and Spain white for decades on end. And the way you sealed a peace like that, in this world, the way you made it stick, was with marriages. Real ones, with real girls. Claude to Charles of Lorraine, her older sister Elizabeth to Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch on the continent, a man more than old enough to be the girl's father, and the king's own sister Margaret to the Duke of Savoy. 3 weddings to bind up a whole continent's worth of accumulated grudges and dead soldiers. The court of France in the early summer of 1559 was supposed to be, by design, the happiest and most glittering place in all of Europe. A triumph, a new beginning. And then, right in the middle of the celebrations for all of it, the king died in front of everyone, slowly, over the course of 10 days, with a piece of wood lodged in his brain. I have to slow down here and breathe, because this is one of the single most infamous deaths in all of French history, and it happened in the very thick of Claude's wedding festivities. Henry II loved to joust. He was good at it, genuinely good, and proud of being good at it, and he was 40 years old now and not quite as young as he used to be. And he'd lately started getting dizzy spells after hard exertion, the sort of thing his doctors and his wife both noticed and quietly worried about between themselves. A great tournament was held near the Hôtel des Tournelles in Paris at the end of June to celebrate the peace and the marriages all at once. The king rode in it, of course he did, and he wore the colours of Diane de Poitiers, his mistress, into the lists, not the colours of his queen. At the celebration of his own daughter's marriages, the king carried the favour of the other woman in front of the entire assembled court, a small, quiet dagger that, if you happen to be Catherine, sitting in the stands, watching. He'd had a good day in the saddle and was meant to be finished, but he wanted one more pass. One more course against a young captain of his Scottish Guard named Gabriel de Montgomery. And Montgomery, to his credit, actually tried to refuse the king, tried to beg off. But kings get to insist, and this one did. So the two of them rode at each other down the lists, and the lances struck home, and Montgomery's lance shattered against the king's helmet. Now, that happens. That's normal. A broken lance is simply part of the sport. Splinters fly all the time. It's nothing. The problem was the long, jagged splinter left in Montgomery's hand, the one he didn't drop quite fast enough, the stub of broken wood that drove upward under the king's raised visor, straight through his right eye and on into his brain. He didn't die at once. That's the true horror sitting at the center of it. He stayed alive for 10 full days. And the two greatest medical minds in all of Europe were both standing right there in the room, helpless. Ambroise Paré, the surgeon I told you to remember, and Andreas Vesalius, the Flemish anatomist, who'd more or less single-handedly founded the modern study of the human body. The two best doctors alive on the planet, leaning over the wounded King of France, and the strategy they settled on, in the end, was mostly to wait and to watch. They reportedly tried to understand the wound by driving splinters into the heads of condemned prisoners, to see what such an injury might be doing deep inside the king's skull where they couldn't look. That tells you everything about the level of desperation in that room. Nothing could be done. The wound went septic. An abscess formed and grew in his brain. And on the 10th of July, 1559, Henry II of France died in agony in his bed of a sporting accident at his own children's wedding party. So Claude, 11 years old, freshly married that very winter, spent part of that summer watching her father die over a week and a half from a splintered lance during the parties thrown to celebrate her wedding. Let that pairing sit there for a moment, because it's almost too neat and too cruel to be real. Her wedding and her father's death are stitched into the very same few weeks of her life. That is the world she was being handed into, and her mother, 40 years old, suddenly and shockingly a widow, suddenly the single most important person in France, stepped out of the long shadow she'd lived inside for decades and began, right there, to become the Catherine de Medici that history actually remembers. The black-clad Queen Mother, the schemer, the survivor. There's a long, dark tale to this moment, too, one that says a lot about the family Claude came from. Catherine never forgave Montgomery, not ever. Even though it was plainly a sporting accident, even though it wasn't his fault, even though the man had tried to refuse the match. Montgomery later became a Protestant and a rebel against the crown, and years afterward, Catherine had him hunted down, caught, and beheaded. The grudge outlived the king himself by a full 15 years. That's the mother. Keep her in mind. The woman who could nurse her sick daughter on a roadside with her own hands, and also wait 15 years to take a man's head over an accident. It's worth staying with Catherine in that moment of widowhood, because it changes everything about the family Claude belonged to, and therefore everything about the forces that would shape Claude's remaining years. Catherine took the black of mourning and, by most accounts, never really put it back off again. She adopted a personal emblem of a broken lance with a motto about her tears and her pain, and wore her grief like a uniform for the rest of her long life. She'd been a queen who was tolerated, sidelined, overshadowed by a mistress, more or less ignored in matters of real power for 26 years of marriage. And in the space of 10 days in July, she became the woman who would effectively run France, through the reigns of 3 of her own sons, for the next 30 years. The girl whose wedding triggered the tournament had, in a sense, witnessed the exact hinge on which her mother's whole life and the whole fate of France turned. Claude was right there for it, 11 years old, watching the most important transformation of the century happen to her own family during her own celebration. And then she was sent away to Lorraine, and the great drama she'd been born into the center of went on without her, while she got on with the quieter, bloodier work of bearing children. Right, let's get Claude to Lorraine, because that is where the rest of her short life is going to play out, far from the great cathedral and the tournament ground. She went to live with Charles in late 1559, around the very same time her older sister Elizabeth set off for Spain, and the king's sister set off for Savoy. The girls of the family scattered across the map of Europe within months of one another, each one packed up and shipped off to a different court to be somebody's wife and somebody's mother. And here, in the middle of all this cold calculation, there's one small mercy worth pausing on. Lorraine was close. Nancy wasn't Madrid. It wasn't on the far side of the Pyrenees, the way Spain was for poor Elizabeth, who would see her own family maybe one more time in her entire life before she died young in a foreign country. Lorraine was right next door to France, practically a neighbor. Claude could come home. Her mother could come and visit her. The family stayed within reach of one another, and given how this family operated, given the lengths Catherine went to in order to keep her children near her and useful, that closeness was a genuine gift. It meant Claude, alone among the scattered sisters, didn't entirely vanish from her mother's world. I want to stay with Elizabeth for just a moment, because her fate throws Claude's into sharp relief, and because the 2 sisters had grown up side by side in that same nursery. Elizabeth was the older one, the one married to the most powerful king in the world, the glamorous match, the one the whole piece had been built around. And Elizabeth's life in Spain became a slow tragedy of its own. She was married to Philip II, a grave, devout, much older man, and she spent her years there far from everyone she'd ever known, surrounded by a court that spoke a language she had to learn, watched and measured constantly for signs of the heir she was expected to produce. She miscarried. She bore daughters. And in 1568, at 23 years old, she died after a difficult premature birth bled by her doctors according to the best medical thinking of the day, killed a little faster, in other words, by the very people trying to save her. So Claude, sitting in Nancy, would have received the news that her older sister, her nursery companion, the bright one, was dead at 23, of exactly the thing that would eventually kill Claude herself at 27. 2 daughters of Catherine de' Medici, 2 arranged marriages, 2 foreign courts, and the same quiet, expected female death waiting at the end of both of them. The only real difference was that Claude got a few more years and a kinder husband before her turn came. That comparison makes the word brutal feel almost too gentle. Nancy, the place she'd live out her days, was being deliberately built up into a proper Renaissance capital. The Dukes of Lorraine kept a palace there, a striking building that mixed the late, soaring Gothic style with the new Italian fashion coming up out of the south, complete with a long ceremonial gallery, the Galerie des Cerfs, the Gallery of Stags, hung with the hunting trophies and the grandeur that a serious ruling house liked to display to anyone it wanted to impress. Charles was building, founding, ruling, doing all the things an ambitious young duke is supposed to do. He's generally remembered as one of the better dukes Lorraine ever had, presiding over what later writers called the most prosperous and brilliant single stretch in the whole long history of the duchy. He founded a university at Pont-à-Mousson. He played the nearly impossible game of staying neutral between France and the Empire, balanced on the knife's edge between 2 giants, and somehow he mostly pulled it off for decades. And by everything we can find, he and Claude actually genuinely liked each other. The move itself, from France to Lorraine, would have been an undertaking in its own right, and worth picturing for a second, because we forget how physically hard travel was. A great noblewoman didn't simply arrive somewhere. She processed there, slowly, over days, in a baggage train of carts and wagons and mounted attendants, along roads that were rutted in summer and impassable mud in winter, through a countryside where the gap between one walled town and the next could be a long, exposed, anxious stretch with no protection if anything went wrong. Claude made that kind of journey more than once in her life, back and forth between Lorraine and the French court, and at least one of those journeys, the one toward her sister's wedding, ended with her seriously ill on the road. So the closeness of Lorraine to France that I called a mercy was a relative thing. It was close compared to Spain. It was still a hard, jolting, dangerous passage every time she made it. The sort of thing that wore a frail body down further every year. What her actual daily life in Nancy looked like, we have to reconstruct mostly from the shape of the world around her, rather than from her own words, because she left us so few. A duchess consort ran a household, a large and complicated one, with its own hierarchy of ladies and servants and officials. She had religious duties, the daily round of mass and devotion that structured an aristocratic woman's day from morning. She had ceremonial duties, the receiving of guests, the presiding over feasts and christenings, and the endless theatre of a court that needed to look magnificent to be taken seriously by its larger neighbours. And underneath all of that, the constant, grinding undertow of pregnancy. She would have moved through the gallery of stags and the great rooms of that palace pregnant most of the time, presiding over a glittering court while carrying the next child, then withdrawing into confinement, then emerging, then doing it all again. The splendor and the suffering ran on exactly the same calendar. That deserves a real moment of attention, because it's so vanishingly rare in these stories that it's almost startling when it turns up. The overwhelming majority of these arranged royal marriages were transactions, plain and simple, that the two people inside them simply endured for as long as they had to, sometimes for decades, sometimes with open contempt. This one seems to have been warm. Charles was described as kind and attentive to her, and the single strongest piece of evidence for all of it comes from the way he behaved after she died, which we'll reach in time, but I'll plant the seed now so it's growing in the back of your mind. He was widowed young. He could have remarried easily, advantageously, immediately. It would have been the obviously sensible thing to do, dynastically, and he refused. He simply refused to do it. He said he could never find her like again. A ruling duke turning down advantageous remarriage out of what reads plainly as grief, and then holding to that refusal for the rest of his life. That is not the sort of thing you can fake into the historical record. It doesn't benefit anyone to invent it. Whatever else was hard and brutal about Claude's life, and a great deal of it was, the marriage itself doesn't seem to have been the hard part. If anything, the marriage was the one soft place in an otherwise punishing existence, the place she got to be a person beside a man who valued her. And Brantôme, our one eyewitness again, the man who actually went there, said something else worth holding on to. He said she helped Charles govern, that she assisted him actively in the running of his lands and his principalities. So she was not decorative. She was not a pretty ornament parked in the gallery of stags to produce babies and nod at banquets. She was a working partner in the actual labor of ruling a duchy, a real political presence in the daily life of Nancy, trusted by a husband who clearly thought she was worth trusting. For a woman in this world, in this century, that is about as good as the whole arrangement was ever going to get. A husband who liked her, leaned on her judgment, and wouldn't replace her when she was gone. The first few years in Lorraine, before the children started, are the closest thing Claude had to a normal life, and they're almost completely dark to us, which tells you something in itself. A young couple, a teenage duke, and his even younger duchess, settling into a court that was being built up around them, learning to govern, learning each other. She was 12, 13, 14, growing up in a foreign court that was, at least, a kind and prosperous one, married to a boy she'd known since childhood who seems to have treated her well. If she had any years that were simply hers, any stretch where she got to be a person growing up rather than a body being used, it was this short window. And then, around her 16th birthday, the window closed. The first pregnancy came, and the long part of her life began, the part that was really just the same year repeated 9 times with different children at the end of it. We have no letters from those quiet early years, no record of what she made of her new home, whether she was homesick, whether she and Charles were happy in the ordinary daily way. The silence is the point. The peaceful stretch of her life left no mark, because peace rarely does. It's the suffering that gets written down. There's a family knot here I have to untangle for you, because it ties Claude directly into the bloodiest French politics of the entire century, whether she wanted it or not. The ruling house of Lorraine had a famous junior branch, an offshoot, the Guise family. And the Guises were a force. French-based, enormously powerful, fabulously ambitious, the hard, armored fist of militant Catholicism in France, led by men like the Duke of Guise and his brother the Cardinal of Lorraine. They held a special semi-royal status at the French court, treated almost as foreign princes in their own right. So Claude, by marrying into the senior Lorraine line, became kin to the Guises, related by blood and marriage to the very faction that the French crown both leaned on and quietly feared, the faction whose bottomless appetite for crushing the Protestants would help set the entire kingdom on fire within her lifetime. And around 1570, Claude seems to have done a bit of quiet family diplomacy inside that very orbit. She apparently helped smooth over a Guise marriage, and she reportedly stepped in to defend her own little sister Marguerite against some ugly court gossip that was trying to link Marguerite romantically to one of the Guise men. So she was woven, deliberately and by birth and by marriage both, into the dangerous, smouldering middle of everything, related to everyone, useful to everyone, standing, without ever choosing it, at the exact crossroads of the forces that were about to tear France apart. That role, the family peacemaker, the one who smooths things over and stands between feuding relatives, is the closest thing we have to a portrait of Claude's actual personality, and it fits everything else we know. Brantôme called her kind. Her husband trusted her with the work of governing. Her mother loved her above the others. The picture that emerges, faint but consistent, is of a gentle, capable, conciliatory woman in a family and a world made almost entirely of sharp edges and clashing ambitions. She seems to have been the one who tried to lower the temperature in a room, to defend the absent sister against the rumor, to make the difficult marriage work. In a household where her mother kept a list of grudges 15 years long, and her in-laws were busy organizing the persecution of half the country, Claude appears to have spent her energy trying to hold the pieces of her family together, rather than play them off against each other. It's not the sort of thing that gets you remembered. The conciliators never get the statues. But it's there in the record if you look, the shape of someone genuinely decent stuck in the middle of something genuinely terrible. Now, the heart of the whole thing. The part that makes the word brutal an honest description rather than a cheap thumbnail. The childbearing. This is what her life actually was, underneath the titles and the alliances. This is what they used her for. Claude had 9 children, 9, in a marriage that, if you start counting from the point where she was actually old enough to be a wife in the full sense, ran a little over a decade of fertile years. She started giving birth in her mid-teens, and she did not stop, not once, not for any meaningful length of time, until the day she died. Let me walk you through them. Not as a dry list of names to forget the moment I say them, but as the actual grinding rhythm of a young woman's body being used, and used, and used again, until it broke under the weight of it. The first was Henry, born in November of 1563, the heir, the future Duke Henry II of Lorraine. Claude was 16 years old when she bore him. 16. His baptism, held at Bar-le-Duc, was a glittering, spectacular affair, attended by Catherine de' Medici herself, who came up from France to bask in the arrival of her grandson. Little Marguerite, Claude's sister, was about 10 at the time, and she remembered the sheer splendor of that christening for the rest of her life, wrote about it decades later. So the very first birth came wrapped in celebration, with a powerful grandmother who showed up in person to mark it. 16 years old, and already a mother, already the producer of an heir to a duchy, already doing the one job that the entire machinery of 2 royal houses had been pointing her toward since before she could walk. A 16-year-old body is not, despite what that century believed, fully ready to bear children. Girls married young and pushed into early childbearing suffered for it. Their not yet finished bodies asked to do something that strained even mature women to the breaking point. The medical thinking of the day held that a girl was ready for childbearing more or less as soon as she could conceive, and that the sooner a noble wife started producing heirs, the better, the safer, the more dynastically sound. The actual evidence of bodies told a different story, one nobody was reading correctly. Early first births were more dangerous, more likely to go wrong, harder on a frame that hadn't finished growing. And Claude, remember, came from a delicate family and had been a sickly child. So that first birth at 16, glittering christening and all, was already asking a great deal of her. And it was only the first. She had no way of knowing, holding her newborn heir in that celebrated chamber, that it was the opening move in a sequence that would run, with barely a pause, for the entire rest of her life. And her mother's presence at that christening tells you something about how much the birth mattered to the wider family. Catherine de' Medici did not travel lightly, and she did not turn up for nothing. For the Queen Mother of France to come up to Bar-le-Duc in person to stand over her grandson was a statement, to Lorraine and to everyone watching, that this child, Claude's child, mattered to the crown of France. The whole point of Claude's marriage, the binding of Lorraine to France, was being made flesh in that cradle, and Catherine came to see it with her own eyes. For Claude, 16 and recovering from her first delivery, it must have been a strange mixture. The pride of having done the thing asked of her, her mother there to witness it, the splendor of the ceremony, and underneath it all the quiet, unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning of what her body would be asked to give. And then they simply kept coming, one after another, year after year. Christine, in August of 1565, who would grow up to marry into the Medici and become the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, and who, after her mother's early death, would be taken in and raised by her grandmother Catherine, becoming one of the old queen's particular favorites. Charles, in July of 1567, who went into the church and rose to become a cardinal and a bishop. Antoinette, in August of 1568, who would marry a German duke and carry the bloodline east. Anne, in 1569, who did not survive childhood, one of the ones the family lost. Francis, in February of 1572, the second surviving son. Catherine, in November of 1573, who became an abbess. Elizabeth, in October of 1574, who would become an electress over in Bavaria. And the last one, another daughter, born right around the time everything ended in early 1575, also named Claude, who herself died as a baby the following year, never even outliving the loss of her mother by long. Look at what those names actually became, though, because there's something worth sitting with in it. Claude didn't live to see almost any of it. She died when her eldest was 11 and her youngest was an infant. She never saw Christine become a Grand Duchess in Florence, ruling alongside the Medici her own mother had come from, closing a circle nobody could have planned. She never saw her son Henry grow into the Duke who'd lead Lorraine after his father. She never saw the daughter who became an electress, or the one who took the veil and ran an abbey, or her sons in their cardinal's red. She did the entire physical work of producing all of those futures, paid for every one of them in blood and risk and recovery, and then was gone before a single one of them came true. The whole purpose she'd been raised and married and bred for, the continuation of two great houses, succeeded completely. And she wasn't there to see it succeed. That's the particular cruelty of a life like hers, spent entirely on a future she was never allowed to reach. And the daughter Anne, the one who didn't survive childhood, is its own small buried grief inside the larger one. We know almost nothing about her beyond the year of her birth and the fact that she died young. But Claude buried that child. A mother who had already risked her life to bear the girl then had to bury her somewhere in the middle of all the other pregnancies, while preparing her body to do the whole thing over again. The record gives us a name and 2 dates and moves on, the way the record always does. But there was a real child there, and a real loss, folded quietly into a list that's easy to read straight past. Read those dates back to yourself, slowly, and watch the spacing of them. 1563, 1565, 1567, 1568, 1569, 1572, 1573, 1574, 1575. Whole stretches are buried in that sequence where she is barely getting up out of one childbed before she's carrying the next one, a child roughly every year and a half, year after year after year, with the small gaps mostly explained by the recovery a battered body simply needs, and sometimes by the children who didn't make it to a christening at all. She was pregnant, or nursing, or recovering, or some exhausting combination of all three, for essentially the entire span of her adult life, from 16 to 27. For 11 years, her body was almost never, in any real sense, her own. It belonged to the duchy. It belonged to the bloodline. It belonged to everyone but her. I want us to actually sit inside what that meant, physically, in the 1560s and 1570s, because we've sanitized childbirth so completely in our own modern heads that the real danger of it back then barely registers anymore. It just slides past as a date and a baby's name. Giving birth in this period was one of the single most dangerous things a human being could do. Full stop. No qualification. And being rich and royal and surrounded by the best people money could buy did not protect you from it. In a number of grim ways, it actively made things worse. The hard numbers we can actually pin down come mostly from English parish records from a little later, one London parish in particular that tracked these things carefully across the 1580s and 1590s, and recorded something on the order of 1 maternal death for every 43 babies baptized. That's the general population, ordinary women. And the studies that have looked specifically at the aristocracy, the women with the best food and the warmest rooms and the most attendants crowded around the bed, found that they died in childbirth at higher rates than ordinary women did. Not lower. Higher. partly because they were married off younger and started bearing earlier, partly because they were pushed relentlessly to keep producing heirs, partly because their expensive, fashionable doctors intervened more, and intervention in that era, with no understanding of infection, usually meant a fresh chance to introduce the thing that would kill you a week later. Run Claude's own number against that grim arithmetic for a second. 1 death in 43 deliveries is the baseline for ordinary women across a single pregnancy. Claude went through it 9 times. Every single delivery was a fresh roll of those loaded dice, and she was rolling them as a noblewoman in the higher risk category who'd started young and came from a frail family. The odds were never going to hold forever. A woman bearing 1 or 2 children might reasonably hope to come through. A woman bearing 9, starting at 16, in that century, with that body, was statistically almost certain to be caught eventually. It wasn't bad luck that the 9th confinement killed her. It was, in the coldest sense, the expected outcome of doing the thing 9 times. The remarkable part, the genuinely lucky part, is that she survived the first 8. The 9th was the law of averages finally collecting what it was owed, and the room itself, for a royal birth, was its own particular ordeal. A high-born woman was confined for the birth, shut away into a chamber with the windows covered over and the air kept deliberately close and warm, because the medicine of the day was convinced that bad air and bad humours crept in through light and drafts and did the damage. So you laboured in a hot, dim, sealed room, often with an audience of other women crowded around, sometimes with official witnesses present for the express purpose of confirming the birth was real and the child legitimate. No swapped babies, no substituted heirs. No pain relief worth the name. None. No understanding whatsoever of infection, no hand-washing, no faint suspicion that the unwashed hands reaching into a labouring woman might be the very thing that would carry her off with fever in the days after. And the expectation, the thing women were quite literally instructed to do, was to make their confession and to write or revise their will before their time came. Because everyone involved, understood that you might simply not get up again. A pregnant noblewoman put her soul and her estate in good order before each delivery, the way a soldier might before walking into a battle he's not sure he'll walk out of. 9 times, in Claude's case. 9 separate times getting her affairs in order. 9 times not knowing if this was the one that would take her. And what actually went wrong, in the births that killed women, was usually one of a handful of things, none of which the medicine of the time could do anything to stop. A labour that simply would not progress. The child stuck, hour after hour, day sometimes, until the mother was exhausted past the point of survival. A hemorrhage afterward, bleeding that nobody could staunch. Or, most commonly of all, the slow killer. The fever that came in the days following an apparently successful birth. The infection introduced by the very hands meant to help, that turned a living new mother into a dying one over the course of a week, while everyone around her watched and prayed and bled her and gave her useless remedies. That last one is almost certainly the shadow over the drunken midwife story. An attendant who didn't know to keep her hands and instruments clean, who reached in to help and introduce the thing that would kill the Duchess days later, could absolutely be blamed in hindsight for a death she caused without ever understanding how. The midwife's whine made her an easy target, but the truth is that almost any attendant in that century might have done the same damage stone sober, because nobody, not the village midwife and not the king's own surgeon, understood the thing that was actually doing the killing. We don't have her private letters, no diary pouring out how she felt about any of this. So I'm not going to stand here and put invented feelings into her mouth. But you genuinely don't need a diary to understand the physical reality of it. A teenager, and then a young woman, walking into that sealed, hot, dim room again and again and again, year after year, surviving it 8 times running, knowing each and every time that it could easily be the last thing she ever did. That is the brutality. That's where it lives, not in a villain, not in a torturer, not in some single dramatic act of cruelty you could point to and condemn. Just in the ordinary, relentless, fully expected work of being a royal wife, grinding a real person down to nothing through the sheer, patient repetition of it. And while her body was busy doing all of that, the rest of the family was being pulled into the worst single event of the entire century. I have to take you out of Nancy for a little while here, because Claude was personally present for the lead-up to it, and it's one of the very few moments in her short life where the quiet, overlooked Duchess steps right up into the foreground of history, and we actually get to see her act. In August of 1572, Claude's little sister Marguerite was married in Paris to Henri of Navarre, a leading Protestant prince. The entire stated point of the wedding was supposed to be reconciliation, healing the terrible split that had been steadily tearing France apart for years, Catholic and Protestant brought together under one roof, the king's own Catholic sister married to a Protestant king in waiting, a living symbol that the two halves of a broken country could somehow be sewn back together. Protestant nobles flooded into Paris by the hundreds for the celebration, pouring into a city that, by and large, hated them with a deep and ready hatred. Claude travelled toward the wedding to be there for her sister, and on the way, she fell ill. That documented illness I mentioned to you earlier, sick enough that her mother stopped everything and nursed her at Chalons. A small, tender domestic detail, mother and daughter on the road, the formidable Catherine tending to her favourite girl with her own hands. And it also happened to keep Catherine away from the heart of the court at a particularly tense and delicate moment, which historians have certainly noticed and chewed over. Sit with that roadside scene for a second, because it's one of the very few genuinely intimate glimpses we get of Claude, and it's quietly devastating in hindsight. Here's a woman who'd already borne several children, worn down enough that a journey laid her low, stopped at Chalons too sick to go on, with her mother, the most feared woman in France, setting aside the business of the realm to nurse her own daughter back to her feet. For a moment, Claude isn't a duchess or a diplomatic instrument or a vessel for heirs. She's just a sick young woman being looked after by her mother, the way sick people have always been looked after. And the cruel timing of it is that this tender little pause came right before the worst atrocity of the age, and that the same body being nursed at Chalons was the body that would give out for good less than 3 years later. Catherine could nurse her through a fever on the road. She couldn't nurse her through what childbearing was steadily doing to her. The illness at Chalon was survivable. The thing that was actually killing Claude, slowly, one pregnancy at a time, was not anything a cool cloth and a mother's attention could touch. What happened just a few days after that wedding is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the small hours of the 24th of August, the Crown, or factions operating within it, set in motion the killing of the Protestant leaders gathered in Paris, and the whole thing spiraled almost instantly out of anyone's control. It ballooned into a citywide slaughter that spread from Paris out to other towns across France, went on for days, and killed thousands of people in the streets and in their beds. It's one of the darkest, most shameful things in all of French history, and the precise chain of who decided exactly what and when is still argued over fiercely by historians to this day. But what I can tell you with confidence is what Claude did, because her sister wrote it down in her own memoirs years later. Marguerite described the night before it all began, and she says, plainly, that Claude knew. Claude had somehow learned that something terrible was being planned against the Protestants, against Marguerite's brand new husband and all his people. And Claude, sick with worry and fear, grabbed her sister by the arm and begged her not to go back to her husband's chamber that night. She turned to their own mother and said, openly, that it was not right to send Marguerite to be sacrificed, because if anything were discovered, Navarre's people would surely take their revenge on her, and Catherine overruled her flatly, coldly. She told Marguerite to go, said she would be perfectly safe if God willed it, said that keeping her away now would only raise suspicion and risk the whole plan. And then she ordered Claude to be quiet, to say no more, not another word. And Claude, according to her sister's account, burst into tears. Hold that picture in your mind for a second, because it's one of the only times we really get to see Claude as a person rather than a name on a genealogy chart. Two sisters. One of them, Claude, recently sick and worn down by her endless pregnancies, the older of the two, trying with everything she has to protect the younger one from a horror she can clearly see coming. And their mother, the cold strategist, shutting it all down for the sake of the larger plan, silencing her own daughter mid-sentence. And Claude crying, weeping, because she could see the catastrophe coming and she could not stop it, and she wasn't even permitted to properly warn the person she was trying to save. When the killing finally started, Marguerite ended up taking shelter, and at one point a wounded Protestant courtier fled, bleeding, into her rooms looking for sanctuary, and survived, because she gave it to him. Claude's instinct that night, her one recorded political act of conscience, was to shield, to pull her sister back from the edge of the pit. She simply did not have the power to do it against a mother like Catherine. What unfolded over the following days, the thing Claude had seen coming and been forbidden to warn against, is hard to overstate. It started with the targeted killing of the Protestant leadership, the men who'd come to Paris for the wedding, and then it broke its banks completely. The ordinary Catholic population of Paris, primed by years of preaching and fear and hatred, took it as license, and the slaughter spread through the streets, house to house, neighbor killing neighbor, bodies thrown into the Seine until the river was said to be choked with them. It spread out of Paris to other towns over the following weeks. The total number of dead has never been settled. The estimates run from a few thousand to many times that, but the scale was enormous, and the horror of it echoed across Europe for generations. Protestant Europe never forgot it. And Claude had been standing in the room the night before, knowing enough to weep, related by marriage to the men doing the organizing, sister to the bride whose wedding had drawn the victims into the trap. She wasn't a perpetrator. She wasn't really even a bystander in the ordinary sense. She was a young woman who'd glimpsed the machine her family was about to set running and tried, uselessly, to pull one person she loved out of its path. And keep this knotted in your mind as you watch the scene. Claude was related, by her marriage, to the Guises, the Catholic hardliners who were sitting right at the very center of the massacre's planning, the family carrying the deepest grudge of all against the Protestant admiral who was the first man marked to die. So Claude was standing physically inside a family that helped strike the spark, that helped light the whole fire, and her one clear human impulse was to drag her own sister away from the flames. I'm not going to turn her into a saint over the events of a single night. That wouldn't be honest either, but it's a genuinely, deeply human moment. A woman trying to use what tiny scrap of influence she actually possessed to keep someone she loved alive, and being told by her own mother to sit down and be silent, and then weeping when she obeyed. She went back to Lorraine after all of that, back to Nancy, back to the cycle, because the cycle didn't care what she'd just witnessed. More pregnancies. Catherine in 1573, Elizabeth in 1574. There's one small, almost sweet story attached to that 1573 christening that I want to give you, because Claude's quiet little court turns out to be the unlikely setting for a piece of much grander history. Claude's brother Henry, the future Henry III of France, passed through Lorraine on his way to go and be the King of Poland. Of all the strange jobs, a crown he'd hold only briefly before abandoning it and bolting back to France the moment a better throne came open. And while he was at Claude's court, taking part in the family celebration, he noticed a young woman, Louise of Lorraine-Vaudémont, a cousin of Claude's husband, and he remembered her. He came back later and married her and made her Queen of France. So Claude's overlooked court in Nancy was, among everything else it was, the place where a future King of France first laid eyes on his future queen. Little threads like that one run all through her quiet life, connecting her small, forgotten duchy to the grand and terrible events that everyone else gets to be remembered for. She was always there, just off to the side of the famous moments, holding the room together. And there's a quiet irony in that particular thread, when you sit with it. Louise of Lorraine, the young woman Henry spotted at Claude's court, went on to become one of the gentlest and most genuinely loved queens France ever had, devoted to a difficult husband, kind, devout, the sort of figure who, like Claude herself, gets remembered fondly by the few who bother to remember her at all and ignored by everyone else. Two gentle Lorraine women, one hosting and one being noticed across a crowded room, both destined to spend their lives quietly serving men and dynasties that history would judge far more harshly than it judged them. Claude brought them into the same room without ever knowing what she'd set in motion. That was the strange position she occupied her whole life. always at the edge of the great events, hosting them, related to all the players, the connective tissue between France and Lorraine, between the crown and the Guises, between one royal marriage and the next, and almost never the person anyone was actually looking at. The Duchess in the doorway while history happened in the middle of her own hall. The visit itself would have been an enormous undertaking for her court, and another performance staged while she was pregnant or freshly recovered, because she nearly always was. A passing king, a christening, the eyes of two royal houses on Nancy at once, all of it to be fed and housed and dazzled, the gallery of stags lit up, the household running at full stretch. And Claude at the centre of it, the daughter of France and Duchess of Lorraine, doing the work of making her husband's small duchy look like the equal of the great powers it sat between. She did that over and over, in between the confinements, while her body carried the next child. The splendor was real, and the cost of producing it was paid quietly, in the same body that was producing everything else. But the births kept coming, and her body kept paying the bill for them. 8 times she walked into that hot, sealed, dim room, and 8 times she walked back out of it alive, carrying or having delivered another small life. The 9th time, in February of 1575, she did not walk back out. She died on the 21st of February, 1575, at Nancy, 27 years old. She died of the complications of childbirth in her 9th confinement, and the one vivid detail that survives down to us is the one I opened this whole thing with, the one from Brantôme, who laid the blame on an old midwife from Paris. A drunkard, he said, in whom Claude had placed more faith than in anyone else attending her. Now, whether that's literally and precisely true, whether one drunk midwife really did tip a difficult birth over the edge into a fatal one through some specific error, or whether Brantôme was simply reaching for someone to blame for a death that could have had 100 different causes, none of them anyone's fault, we genuinely cannot know for certain. He had his loyalties. He loved the House of Lorraine. He was attached to it, and he was writing well after the fact, from memory and from second-hand report. But the core of it, the heart of the matter, isn't really in any doubt at all. A young woman who had given birth 9 times in a dozen years died in the act of giving birth one final time. The body can only be asked to do that so many times before it simply has no more to give. The midwife, drunk or sober, was at most the last small weight on a scale that had been tipping for years. By this final pregnancy, think about what her body had already been through. 9 conceptions, 8 deliveries survived. Years of carrying, bearing, recovering, and beginning again, with the recoveries getting harder each time the way they always do. The body a little more worn, a little slower to mend, a little more depleted of whatever reserve it had started with. She'd buried at least 1 child. She was 27 and her body was, in the only way that mattered, much older than that, used hard, asked for more than any frame could reasonably give. The 9th confinement found a woman who'd been running this gauntlet since she was 16, with nothing left in reserve. Whatever went wrong in that room, whether it was the trusted midwife's fatal mistake or a hemorrhage or the slow fever or simply a body that had finally reached its limit, it found her already at the end of her strength. She'd been spending herself in installments for 11 years, and in February of 1575 the account simply came due. The baby, the last daughter, also named Claude, survived the birth itself but died the following year. So the very pregnancy that killed the mother did not even produce a child who would live to grow up. There's a brutal arithmetic in that, the kind this century ran on without flinching, without apology. A life spent, and nothing lasting to show for that final spending of it. She was buried in Nancy, in the church of the Cordeliers, the Église Saint-François des Cordeliers, the burial place of the Dukes of Lorraine, where her husband's family had laid their dead for generations and would go on laying them for generations more. A French king's daughter ending up at last in the necropolis of a small, squeezed, in-between duchy. A long way, in spirit and in grandeur, from the great royal abbey of Saint-Denis, where her own father and her brothers, the kings, would lie in state under their carved tombs. She'd been born a daughter of France, and she was buried a Duchess of Lorraine, and the distance between those two things is, in a way, the whole shape of her life. It's strange, and a little sad, to think about how the rest of her birth family unraveled in the years right after she died, almost as if she'd been spared the worst of it by going first. Her brother Charles IX, the king during the massacre, died the year before her, in 1574, a young man coughing up blood, haunted, by some accounts, by what had been done in his name. Her brother, Henry III, inherited the throne, the strange, brilliant, doomed last Valois king, the one who'd noticed his future queen at Claude's own court. He'd be assassinated in 1589, stabbed by a fanatical monk, and with him the entire house of Valois, the dynasty Claude had been born into, would simply run out. Extinct in the male line, the crown passing to her sister Marguerite's estranged Protestant husband, Henry of Navarre, the very man Claude had once wept trying to keep her sister away from. The restless youngest brother, Francis, died of illness before any of his schemes came to anything. Marguerite, the famous one, the survivor, outlived nearly all of them, and ended her days having watched her entire family die out around her. So Claude, dead at 27 in childbirth, was in a grim sense one of the lucky ones. She didn't live to watch the house of Valois collapse. She just bore the children who'd carry a different house forward, and then she was gone before the collapse came. Her husband's grief is the thing that lingers longest for me, out of all of it. Charles was still a young man when she died, with decades of rule still stretching out ahead of him. He had every conceivable reason to remarry, politically, dynastically, for the good of his house and his alliances. It was simply what a widowed duke did, as a matter of course, often within the year. He didn't. He stayed unmarried. And the line Brantôme preserved for us is that he said he could never find her like again. Decades of life still in front of him, the easy advantage of a fresh marriage and fresh alliances sitting right there for the taking, and he chose deliberately to spend the rest of his years without another wife rather than try to replace her. You can be cynical about a great deal of royal sentiment. Most of it is performance, but a powerful man giving up the obvious advantage of remarriage and then holding to that choice for the rest of his life is a fairly loud statement made in a very quiet way. Whatever Claude was to the wider world, which was not much, a footnote, an overlooked sister, to the one man who actually lived beside her, day in and day out, She was apparently irreplaceable. Stay with Charles for a moment, because the man Claude was married to matters to how we read her life, and he's a genuinely interesting figure in his own right. He'd been taken from Lorraine as a small boy and raised at the French court as a polished captive, given the finest education the kingdom could buy, and he came out of it a cultivated, capable, ambitious ruler rather than the resentful puppet France might have produced. He governed Lorraine for over 50 years in the end, one of the longest reigns the duchy ever saw, and he steered it through the surrounding wars of religion with a caution that kept his small territory mostly intact, while larger powers tore at each other around it. He built, he founded, he patronized. And he married, at 11 and 15, a French princess he'd grown up alongside, and apparently fell into something that genuinely resembled love, or at least a deep and durable partnership. He brought her into the work of governing. He trusted her. And when she was gone, he carried that broken lance kind of grief, the same shape of grief her own mother wore, refusing the sensible remarriage for the rest of his long life. The two of them, the captive duke and the overlooked princess, made out of a hostage arrangement and a treaty signature one of the few marriages in this whole story that anyone would actually have wanted to be inside. Claude got, almost by accident, the one thing the system was not designed to give her: someone who valued her for herself. And her mother, the formidable, terrifying Catherine, was reportedly devastated by the loss. And this is the part that genuinely complicates the usual flat picture of Catherine de' Medici, the black-clad schemer, the poisoner of dark legend, the woman blamed by history for the massacre itself. Claude was, by most accounts that survive, her favorite, the loyal one, the gentle one, the daughter who kept coming home to be near her, who let her mother nurse her with her own hands when she fell sick on the road, who tried to protect her sister and got told to be quiet for her trouble. Catherine had a complicated, often cold, often manipulative relationship with several of her children. She used them like the pieces on the board she'd been handed, but Claude seems to have been the soft spot, the one she simply loved, without the angle. And when Claude died, Catherine took in her motherless granddaughter, Christine, raised her herself, doted on her, made her one of her own particular favorites, and eventually passed her most treasured belongings down to the girl. The fearsome queen mother, the one history paints as cold all the way through, channeling her real grief for a dead daughter into the raising of that daughter's child. It's one of the more genuinely tender things in Catherine's long, hard, blood-spattered biography, and it exists at all only because Claude existed first, and then was taken away too soon. Think about what Catherine had already buried by the time Claude died in 1575. Her husband, the king, in that grotesque tournament accident. Her son, Francis II, dead as a teenager. Her infant daughters, twins, one of them stillborn in a birth so dangerous it nearly killed Catherine too and ended her own childbearing. Her daughter Elizabeth, dead in Spain at 23. Her son, Charles IX, dead the year before, and now Claude, the favourite, gone at 27 in childbirth. The same way Elizabeth had gone, the same way Catherine's own mother had died days after giving birth to Catherine herself. the same way the first Claude, the grandmother, had gone. Catherine de' Medici had spent her entire life surrounded by women dying in childbirth, beginning with the mother she never knew, and now her gentlest daughter had joined the list. She took Christine and held on. There's a thread you can trace, if you want to, of a woman who lost her mother to childbirth as an infant, watched daughter after daughter follow, and tried to hold on to the granddaughters who were left. The Valois tapestries, those famous woven scenes of the French court, eventually came down to Christine, Claude's daughter, passed from the grieving grandmother to the orphaned girl. Threads of cloth standing in for everything else that couldn't be passed on. I keep circling back in my own head to how little of her there actually is left. We have a small handful of solid facts. A portrait that's contested and possibly not even her. A sister's self-serving memoir. A few warm lines from a man who happened to visit her court once. We don't have her voice, not really, not directly. We don't have letters where she tells us, in her own words, what it felt like to be 11 years old at the altar of Notre Dame, or 16 and bearing an heir to a duchy, or 24 and burying the children of hers who didn't make it, or sick on a cold road while her mother held a cloth to her forehead and the country she'd been born in quietly prepared to butcher the wedding guests at her sister's celebration. We have the bare outline of a life lived almost entirely in service to other people's plans, other people's treaties, other people's bloodlines. And we have to fill in the human part of it ourselves, carefully, by hand, without making things up that aren't there. What we can say, though, without inventing a single thing, is plenty. That she was a child handed over to seal a peace treaty before she was old enough to understand what a treaty was. That she watched her own father die a slow, grotesque public death during the celebrations of her own wedding. That she was married into a family sitting at the dead center of her country's worst violence, related to the men who lit the fire. That she was, against all the odds of her world, actually loved by a husband and by a mother, in a time and a place where being loved was never, ever guaranteed, and usually wasn't on offer at all. That she tried, once, clearly and on the record, to save her sister's life, and was silenced for it by the most powerful woman in France. And that her body was asked to produce heir after heir, child after child, 9 of them, until it finally gave out entirely at the age of 27, in a sealed room, in the middle of winter. None of that requires any embroidery from me. It's brutal enough just sitting there, plainly, exactly as it happened. And the one quality that comes through every thin source we have, the thing nearly everyone who mentions her at all agrees on, is that she was kind. Brantôme, who met her, said the people of Lorraine found her kind for as long as she lived. Her husband valued her enough to refuse another wife. Her mother loved her best. Her sister remembered her trying to protect her in the dark before the killing started. It's a thin word, kind and easy to skim past, but spread across an entire short life that left almost no other trace, it starts to look like the truest thing we know about her. Not a queen, not a schemer, not a famous beauty or a famous villain. A kind woman in an unkind world who was used hard and died young and was mostly forgotten. The record is nearly silent on her, and the little it does say keeps coming back to that one word over and over from everyone who actually knew her. The grandmother she was named for, the first Claude, the one whose real and documented deformities got carelessly pinned onto her by lazy history, had also died young, also worn out in the end by the endless work of childbearing, also gentle, also overshadowed, also mostly forgotten next to a flashier, more glittering court full of more famous people. Two Claudes, 2 generations apart, both of them used up by the very same machine, both of them remembered, when they're remembered at all, mostly for what was supposedly wrong with their bodies, rather than for what their actual lives cost them to live. And the second Claude got even less than the first. At least the grandmother's pain was written down accurately by people who saw it. The granddaughter got a borrowed disability she may never have had, and a footnote at the bottom of someone else's much more interesting page. The same name, the same fate, handed down a generation like an inheritance nobody would want. A girl born in 1547 living out, almost beat for beat, the death of a woman she never met and was named to honor. If there's a crueler way for history to tie 2 lives together, I'm not sure what it would be. If you go to Nancy today, the church is still standing. The Cordeliers, with its ducal tombs lined up inside, the dead dukes of Lorraine and their wives. The palace gallery, the gallery of stags, is part of a museum now. The duchy itself is long, long gone, swallowed up eventually and completely into France. The eternal in-between land finally pulled all the way over onto one side and held there. Charles ruled on for decades after she died, kept building, kept governing, kept not remarrying, year after year. The children scattered out into thrones and convents and bishoprics all across Europe, exactly the way her own generation had scattered before them. The daughters of one Duchess of Lorraine becoming a Grand Duchess down in Florence, an electress over in Bavaria, an abbess in a quiet French house. The sons becoming dukes and cardinals. Claude's blood ran out and spread into the great families of the entire continent, even though Claude herself had barely been allowed to be a whole person before she was reduced to a vessel for carrying it. The church she lies in had a hard history of its own after her, worth a passing word, because even her resting place didn't get to stay peaceful. The Cordeliers and its ducal tombs went through the upheavals that came for so many royal burial sites in the centuries after, the wars and the revolutions that swept through France and tore open the graves of the old order. The Dukes of Lorraine and their wives didn't rest as quietly as the people who buried them intended. So Claude, who'd been moved around in life from palace to palace, married into a foreign court, sent back and forth across dangerous roads, didn't entirely get to stop being moved around even in death. Even now, the woman who hosted history in her own hall is somewhere in that church in Nancy, a French king's daughter a long way from Saint-Denis. Remembered mostly by the handful of people who go looking, and by her name on the tombs of the dukes. A temptation arrives, with a life shaped like this one, to reach at the end for a clean lesson. to say something neat and final about how women were treated, about the cold cruelty of dynastic politics, about a system that married children and bred them to death and then forgot them entirely. And all of those things are true, every one of them, and you can feel them sitting heavily underneath every single fact of her story, without me needing to spell any of it out for you in big letters. But Claude wasn't a lesson. She wasn't a symbol or a case study. She was a girl named after the wrong grandmother, nicknamed after her father's mistress before she could speak, married off at 11, robbed of her father a few months later in the most public and horrifying way imaginable, sent away to a court. She happened, by sheer luck, to find some real kindness in, and then asked to give birth 9 times before she was 30 years old. She survived 8 of those rooms. The 9th one kept her and didn't give her back. That old midwife from Paris, the drunk one Brantôme blamed for the whole thing, we don't even know her name. The woman who may well have been the very last person to touch Claude while she was still alive. And history didn't trouble itself to write her down either. She was probably someone Claude had used before, trusted, sent for specially, brought all the way from Paris because she was good or had been once. That's the small, awful irony buried in Brantôme's line. Claude didn't die at the hands of a stranger or an enemy. She died, if the story holds at all, in the care of a woman she'd chosen herself, leaned on, believed in. 2 unremembered women, in a sealed room, in the cold of February, in a palace in a duchy that doesn't exist anymore on any map, and one of them was the daughter of the King of France. That's where I'm going to leave her. Not wrapped up with a tidy summary, because her life never got the courtesy of a summary, it just stopped, mid-sentence, in a winter room. A young woman in Nancy, 27 years old, who'd done absolutely everything that was ever asked of her, and a few brave things that weren't, gone in the dark of a February confinement, mourned afterward by a husband who refused to ever replace her, and by a mother who took the dead girl's child and raised it as her own. That's me done for today. If you sat through all of this, on a duchess most people have never once heard of, that means a lot to me, more than the big flashy episodes do, honestly. Tell me down in the comments which part stuck with you, the lance, the silenced warning, that nameless midwife. Hit subscribe if you want more of these quiet ones. I'll catch you whenever the next one's ready.